Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Psilocybin University. And as always, I'm your host, Professor Stark. And today I'm bringing you another edition of Microdose Chats. Today's topic of discussion is going to branch off from the topic I discussed in the last edition of Microdose Chats, which was the PF Tech method. Now, anybody who listened to that previous episode heard me briefly go over the process on how to make it, and I did not go over the sterilization process. I also mentioned in the previous episode that there were two ways to sterilize PF Tech, one being the steam sterilization or pressure cooker sterilization. One of the things that does make the PF Tech method unique is that you can use the steam method as opposed to other substrates. Steam sterilization just doesn't work at all for the most part. So today I will touch on steam sterilization as well as pressure cook sterilization when it comes to substrates in general, but more specifically how they relate to the PF Tech method. So before I jump into today's topics, I just wanted to take a moment to go over our social media presence. I just wanted to name a few ways where you guys can get in contact with us or view other content related to this podcast. First, I'll mention that our Twitter is at PsilocybinU. We also have an Instagram, which is Psilocybin University. We also have a website. It's psilocybinuniversity.wordpress.com. We're in the process of trying to get our own website without having to use a host site. As I've mentioned before, we also do have a YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe to it, it's Psilocybin University, the podcast. And finally, I want to once again put in our email. That is psilocybin.university@gmail.com. I suggest you guys follow us on Twitter, Instagram, subscribe to us on YouTube, and check out our website where I post pictures of my own personal home grows and stuff like that. There's content on that website that isn't on YouTube itself or accessible through this podcast. And as always, I invite you guys to email us any suggestions, questions, or topics, or anything that you want that's related to psilocybin mushrooms or the podcast. So let's get started on today's episode. So the first method of sterilization I'm going to talk about is the steam sterilization method. But I must mention that regardless of what method that you choose to use, you might want to put some kind of a steaming rack or aluminum foil or some kind of a cloth at the bottom of the pot to prevent the jars from getting direct contact with the heat source, because the problem with this is if the jars get too hot, they will crack, and that's definitely something you don't want. So the steam sterilization method works because brown rice flour is able to sterilize at lower temperatures, unlike other spawn substrates. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to put the jars into a pot of water. You want to fill the water level up to about halfway up the jars. You're going to want to bring this to a boil, but once it gets to a boil, you don't want to keep the flame up too high because the water's not going to get any higher than about 212 degrees or something like that. And if you leave it on a rolling boil, then things are just going to overflow or start splashing, and then, extra water might get into the jars that way. So basically, once you got it to a boil, you want to put the flame down as low as you can so that the water's still kind of bubbling, but not over bubbling, or like a typical boil. You're going to do this for about an hour to an hour and a half, which is sufficient enough to sterilize the PF Tech jars. You don't really need to do much longer than this, but I definitely don't recommend doing it anything less than an hour. So when you're done steam sterilizing, you can let the jars cool inside of the cooking pot because, that's another way to protect from contaminants. And that's pretty much it with the steam sterilization. The method's very, very simple. You just want to take some precautions, but like I mentioned, because brown rice flour is, it's able to be sterilized at lower temperatures, that's why steam sterilization works so well. Oh, and I'm sorry, I definitely forgot to mention that once you have the water to a boil, just before you bring down the flame to adjust it, you're going to go ahead and you're going to put the lid for the pot on, then lower the flame to where it's a very light simmer. Maybe that part might have seemed obvious, but I definitely wanted to say it directly because I don't want to cause any confusion, because if you do it without the lid and you sit there and try to steam sterilize them for an hour, hour and a half without the lid on, then it's just not going to properly work. So forgive me, definitely overlooked it. Like I said, I get a little ahead of myself sometimes, but yes, you're definitely going to want to put the lid on the pot while you're sterilizing the jars over the course of an hour to an hour and a half. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to talk about sterilizing with a pressure cooker. Now this method I don't have any direct experience with because A, I don't have a pressure cooker, and B, I've never used a pressure cooker. But what I'm going to go over is why, if you have access to a pressure cooker, you should definitely use it over steam sterilization, whether it's PF Tech method or any other substrate you may be using. The reason why sterilizing with a pressure cooker is preferred over steam sterilization is because I mentioned before that steam sterilization reaches temperatures of about 212 degrees, I believe. It's somewhere between 200 and 212. But with a pressure cooker, when you get them going at 15 psi, the temperature inside is going to be around 250 degrees, which is a lot higher than the 210 that you're going to get out of steam sterilization. And the reason this is the better method, if it's not already obvious, is because that at 250 degrees, the steam temperature is hot enough to kill pretty much anything that you got to worry about contaminating your substrate itself. This is why most experienced mushroom growers or people who prepare their own spawn tend to lean towards pressure cooking over steam sterilization. And like I said, if I had a pressure cooker, I would definitely never use steam sterilization, but that's why I primarily use the PF Tech method right now, because the only means I have for sterilization is steam using a pot of water. And as far as how long you're going to pressure cook your substrate jars, it's pretty similar to steam sterilization, but as opposed to like an hour and a half, this method you could probably get away with doing about 45 minutes to an hour. So it's not that much difference of a time, but you could almost guarantee that after that amount of time inside the pressure cooker at 15 psi that there's going to be no contaminants left alive inside of your spawn substrate. But I also have to warn, if you're going to buy a pressure cooker just for these purposes, be very careful when you're using a pressure cooker. I know that if they're used improperly, that things can go south real quick. So definitely look over the user manual for the pressure cooker before trying to use this method. You definitely don't want to misuse a pressure cooker. It's very, very, very dangerous. So that's going to be it for today's microdose chat. I want to thank you guys as always for tuning in. Shortly, I should be coming out with another episode featuring co-host Professor Hadwin. One of the main reasons you haven't heard from him in the past couple episodes is because his work life is a little bit more demanding than mine. I'm pretty much self-employed, and I have a lot more free time than he has. That's why I take liberties at delivering more content in between the times that he's available for the podcast. But I very well expect that the next episode after this one is going to be featuring both of us together. And like I said, I can't wait to get to it. So once again, this is Professor Stark from Psilocybin University. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Peace.